President Ibrahim Traoré sat in his opulent office, surrounded by towering stacks of government files that seemed to mock him with their endless bureaucratic demands. The mahogany desk, polished to perfection, reflected the crystal chandelier above, creating dancing patterns of light that failed to illuminate the growing darkness in his heart. Outside his bulletproof windows, the capital city hummed with activity, but inside these walls, he felt increasingly disconnected from the very people he had sworn to serve. The day had been consumed by endless meetings with ministers, ambassadors, and policy advisors. Charts and graphs had been presented, showing economic growth and development indices that painted a picture of progress. Yet, despite all the positive statistics and glowing reports, Ibrahim couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was missing from his understanding of his nation's reality. His eyes, weathered by years of political battles and the burden of leadership, showed the exhaustion of a man who had climbed to the highest office only to find that the view from the top was often obscured by clouds of bureaucracy and filtered information. The leather chair that had once symbolized achievement now felt like a throne of isolation, separating him from the very people whose lives he was meant to improve. As the evening shadows lengthened across his office, Ibrahim found himself staring at a framed photograph on his desk, a picture from his early political days when he had walked among the people, shaking hands with farmers, listening to mothers' concerns about their children's education, sharing meals with workers who built the nation with their calloused hands. That man in the photograph seemed like a stranger now, someone who had been gradually erased by the protocols and procedures of high office. The sound of a gentle knock interrupted his melancholy. "Come in," he called, straightening in his chair as he prepared for what he assumed would be another briefing about trade agreements or security concerns. Instead, an intelligence officer entered with an unusual air of urgency. Unlike the typical formal reports that crossed his desk daily, this man carried with him the dust of real streets and the weight of genuine human suffering. His name was Officer Khalil, a field operative who specialized in gathering information from the country's most remote and forgotten corners. "Mr. President," Khalil began, his voice carrying an undertone that immediately captured Ibrahim's attention. "I have a report that I believe requires your immediate attention. It's about a village in the remote district of Mehrabad." Ibrahim leaned forward, sensing that this was not going to be another statistical briefing. "Continue." Khalil took a deep breath before beginning his account. "Sir, I've just returned from a fact-finding mission in a village where the most basic human need, water, has become a commodity controlled by local thugs. There's a community well there, built decades ago with government funds, meant to serve the entire village. But a group of criminals has taken control of it. They charge money for every bucket of water. Those who can pay get water. Those who cannot, they return home empty-handed." The words hit Ibrahim like a physical blow. He had always known that poverty existed in his country, that development was uneven, that some communities struggled more than others. But the image of people being denied water, the most fundamental necessity of life, was almost incomprehensible to him. "How long has this been going on?" Ibrahim asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "According to the villagers I spoke with, it's been happening for over 2 years. Local authorities either don't know or choose to ignore it. The criminals have essentially created their own little kingdom of exploitation, but it was Khalil's next words that would change everything for Ibrahim. The intelligence officer's voice began to crack as he continued his report. "Mr. President, 3 days ago, a 7-year-old girl named Fatima died in that village. She had been sick with fever for several days. Her mother, a widow who earns barely enough to feed her children by doing laundry for wealthier families, had no money to pay for water. The criminals refused to let her take even a single cup for her dying daughter." Ibrahim felt the blood drain from his face. "Go on." "The little girl kept asking for water, sir. Her lips were cracked, her fever was burning through her small body, and all she wanted was a drink. Her mother begged the men at the well she offered to work for them to clean their homes, anything. But they laughed at her and told her to come back when she had money. Fatima died that evening, still asking for water that never came. The silence in the presidential office was deafening. Ibrahim's hands began to tremble as the full weight of this tragedy settled upon him. Here he was, the leader of a nation, sitting in an office with multiple water coolers, bathrooms with golden taps, and servants who would bring him anything he desired at the snap of his fingers. Meanwhile, a 7-year-old girl had died of thirst in his own country because criminals had turned water into a business. The mother's cries can still be heard echoing through the village at night. Khalil continued, tears now openly flowing down his cheeks. The neighbors say she sits by the well every evening, calling out her daughter's name and asking Allah why her baby had to die for want of something as simple as water. Ibrahim rose from his chair and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights that twinkled like stars in the darkness. Each light represented a family, a life, a story. How many other Fatimas were out there, suffering while he sat in comfortable ignorance? "What's the village called?" Ibrahim asked, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his heart. "Kasbah Mer, sir. It's about 200 kilometers from here, in a region that rarely sees government officials. The road is poor, and there's no significant economic activity there, so it's been largely forgotten." Ibrahim turned back to face Khalil. "Have any government officials visited this village in recent years?" "Not according to the villagers, sir. The nearest government office is in the district headquarters, almost 50 kilometers away. The people of Kasbah Mer feel completely abandoned." As Khalil finished his report and left the office, Ibrahim remained standing by the window long into the night. The comfortable bubble of presidential life suddenly felt suffocating. All the briefings he received, all the reports that landed on his desk, all the carefully orchestrated tours where he was shown model villages and happy citizens, none of it reflected the reality that Khalil had just described. The image of little Fatima haunted him. A child who had died not because of war, not because of natural disaster, not because of any grand political failing, but because of something as preventable as lack of access to water. It was a failure of leadership, a failure of society, and ultimately, a failure that rested on his shoulders as the nation's leader. That night, Ibrahim made a decision that would change not just his own life, but the course of his presidency and the fate of countless forgotten villages across his nation. He would not send another official to investigate. He would not order a report or form a committee. He would go himself, but not as the president surrounded by protocol and security. He would go as an ordinary man to see with his own eyes what his people truly faced. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, matching Ibrahim's somber mood as he prepared for what might be the most important journey of his political career. He had spent the sleepless night planning every detail of his mission, knowing that any mistake could not only expose his identity, but also rob him of the authentic experience he desperately needed. Standing before his walk-in closet, Ibrahim surveyed the rows of expensive suits, silk ties, and polished shoes that had become the uniform of his elevated station. Each piece of clothing represented the distance that had grown between him and ordinary citizens. Today, all of that had to be stripped away. From the back of his closet, he retrieved clothes he hadn't worn in years. A simple cotton shirt, faded and slightly frayed at the cuffs that he had kept as a memento from his early political days. The fabric was soft from countless washings, bearing the honest marks of wear that spoke of genuine use rather than designer distressing. Over this, he pulled on a worn brown vest, its pockets stretched and its color dulled by time and weather. The transformation continued with a pair of old work pants, their knees slightly worn and their hem dust-stained. Instead of his usual leather dress shoes, he laced up a pair of simple rubber sandals, the kind worn by laborers and farmers throughout the country. Looking at his reflection in the full-length mirror, Ibrahim barely recognized himself, but the physical transformation was only the beginning. He studied his hands, noting their softness and the absence of calluses that would mark a man who worked with his hands. He would need to be careful about that. His posture, too, would need to change. Years of presidential bearing had given him a certain way of carrying himself that would immediately mark him as someone accustomed to authority. The most crucial part of his disguise was yet to come. Ibrahim gathered some dust from a neglected corner of his private quarters and rubbed it into his hands and face, creating the weathered appearance of someone who worked under the sun. He mussed his usually perfectly groomed hair and practiced hunching his shoulders slightly, adopting the posture of a man worn down by daily labor. When he was satisfied with his physical transformation, Ibrahim turned his attention to the practical aspects of his journey. He could not simply walk out of the presidential palace without raising alarms, nor could he take his usual convoy of armored vehicles. Every movement of the president was monitored and coordinated by his security team. He summoned his most trusted security chief, Major General Rashid, a man who had served with unwavering loyalty for over a decade. When Rashid entered the office and saw Ibrahim's transformed appearance, his face immediately filled with concern and confusion. "Sir, what is the meaning of this?" Rashid asked, his military training evident in his direct approach to what he clearly perceived as a security threat. Ibrahim sat down and looked directly at his security chief. "Rashid, I need you to listen to me carefully. What I'm about to ask of you goes against every protocol we've established, but it's something I must do." He then proceeded to explain his plan, watching as Rashid's expression shifted from confusion to alarm to deep concern. When Ibrahim finished speaking, the silence in the room was heavy with the weight of what he was proposing. "Sir, this is incredibly dangerous," Rashid finally said. "You're talking about going into an unknown situation without proper security, without backup, without any of the protections that keep you safe. If something happens to you, if you're recognized, if there's any kind of threat—" "If I don't go," Ibrahim interrupted, "then more children like Fatima will die while I sit in this office reading sanitized reports that tell me everything is fine. Rashid, I've been president for 6 years and I've never truly seen how my people live. Every visit has been choreographed, every interaction filtered through layers of protocol. How can I lead a nation whose reality I don't understand?" Rashid was quiet for a long moment, his mind clearly working through the implications and risks. Finally, he spoke with the measured tone of a professional soldier. "If you're determined to do this, sir, then we need to establish certain parameters. I cannot, in good conscience, allow you to go completely alone. My team and I will shadow you from a distance. We'll remain out of sight unless you signal for help, or unless we perceive an immediate threat to your safety." Ibrahim nodded, understanding that this was likely the best compromise he could hope for. "Agreed, but you must promise me that you'll only intervene if there's genuine danger. I need to experience this as an ordinary citizen would. If people sense that I have protection nearby, they won't behave naturally." They spent the next hour working out the details. Rashid would select a small team of his most discreet operatives who would position themselves at strategic points around the village. Ibrahim would carry a concealed communication device that would allow him to call for help if necessary. Most importantly, Rashid made Ibrahim promise that he would not take unnecessary risks or put himself in situations where his safety could not be guaranteed. As the morning progressed, Ibrahim felt a growing sense of anticipation mixed with apprehension. This would be unlike anything he had done since becoming president. There would be no prepared speeches, no carefully selected audiences, no agenda other than to observe and understand. At precisely noon, Ibrahim left his office through a service entrance rarely used by the president. Instead of his usual armored limousine, he climbed into the back of an ordinary government vehicle driven by one of Rashid's most trusted agents. The man had been briefed to maintain complete silence and to drop Ibrahim at a location several kilometers from his ultimate destination. As they drove through the capital city, Ibrahim saw his nation from a perspective he had almost forgotten. Traffic was heavy and the air was thick with exhaust fumes. Street vendors hawked their wares between cars stopped at red lights. Children in school uniforms walked along busy sidewalks, their book bags slung over their shoulders. Workers on lunch break sat in the shade of buildings, sharing simple meals and conversation. This was the real world. The world beyond the tinted windows of presidential motorcades and the controlled environments of official visits. It was messy, noisy, and vibrantly alive in a way that his sanitized official experiences had never captured. When they reached the outskirts of the city, the driver pulled over near a busy bus station. Ibrahim got out without a word, blending into the crowd of ordinary citizens going about their daily business. For the first time in years, no one looked at him twice. No one stepped aside to let him pass. No one addressed him with the deference due to his office. The anonymity was both liberating and humbling. The local bus that would take Ibrahim to the rural district was a far cry from the luxury vehicles he had become accustomed to. It was an old model, its paint faded and its body bearing the scars of countless journeys over rough roads. Black smoke belched from its exhaust pipe, and the sound of its engine suggested mechanical problems that had been patched rather than properly repaired. As Ibrahim approached the bus, he observed the people waiting to board. They carried with them the possessions and concerns of ordinary life. Farmers with sacks of grain, mothers with small children, elderly passengers clutching worn bags, workers returning home after long shifts in the city. Their clothes were simple and practical, their faces marked by sun and hardship, their conversations filled with the mundane concerns of daily survival. When the bus doors opened with a loud hiss and a grinding sound, passengers pushed forward with the practiced efficiency of people accustomed to crowded public transportation. Ibrahim found himself swept along in the crowd, jostled by elbows and bags, breathing air thick with the sense of humanity. Sweat, cooking spices, cheap soap, and the indefinable smell of lives lived without luxury. He managed to find a seat near the back of the bus, next to an elderly farmer whose weathered hands spoke of decades spent working the soil. The man's clothes were clean but worn, patched in several places with care that suggested poverty rather than choice. His face, deeply lined by years of sun and worry, held a quiet dignity that Ibrahim found profoundly moving. As the bus lurched into motion, Ibrahim was struck by the stark contrast between this journey and his usual travel experience. Instead of smooth highways cleared of traffic, they traveled on roads full of potholes that made the bus bounce and sway. Instead of air conditioning, the windows were open, allowing dust and hot air to swirl through the cramped space. Instead of silence and privacy, he was surrounded by conversations. Crying babies and the constant rumble of an overworked engine. The farmer beside him noticed Ibrahim looking around with what must have appeared to be the curiosity of someone unaccustomed to bus travel. "First time taking this route?" the old man asked kindly, his voice rough but warm. Ibrahim realized he needed to be careful about his responses. Too much curiosity might seem suspicious, but too little might seem rude. "Yes," he replied simply. "I'm going to visit some villages in the area." "Ah," the farmer nodded. "Looking for work, perhaps? Times are hard everywhere, but the villages, they're especially difficult now." "What do you mean?" Ibrahim asked, genuinely interested in hearing an unfiltered perspective on rural conditions. The farmer sighed deeply, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of accumulated disappointments. "Everything costs more now, but we get paid the same for our crops. The government promises development, but we don't see it. Young people leave for the cities because there's nothing for them in the villages. Those of us who remain, we struggle." As the bus continued its bumpy journey, Ibrahim listened to similar conversations around him. A woman behind him was discussing the difficulty of getting medical care for her sick mother. Two men across the aisle were talking about the lack of reliable electricity in their village. A young man near the front was explaining to his companion why he was leaving his family's farm to look for work in a factory. These were the voices that never reached the presidential palace, the perspectives that were filtered out of official reports, the realities that existed beyond the carefully managed world of high office. Each conversation was a window into struggles that Ibrahim had known existed in theory, but had never experienced viscerally. The journey took nearly 3 hours, and by the time Ibrahim disembarked at his destination, a dusty crossroads that barely qualified as a town, he felt as though he had been on a crash course in the real conditions of his nation. His expensive education and years of political experience had prepared him for many things, but not for the simple revelation that came from sitting among ordinary people and hearing their unguarded thoughts. From the bus stop, he still had several kilometers to walk to reach Kasba Mer, the village where little Fatima had died. The road was more of a dirt track, rutted by the wheels of ox carts and the occasional truck. On either side stretched fields that showed signs of the ongoing struggle between human cultivation and natural hardship. Some crops looked healthy and green, while others appeared stunted by drought or poor soil. As he walked, Ibrahim passed small settlements that seemed to exist in a different century from the modern capital he had left that morning. Houses were simple structures of mud brick and corrugated metal, their yards filled with chickens, goats, and the detritus of rural life. Children played with homemade toys, and women worked at outdoor cooking fires, their faces partially covered against the dust. The sun beat down mercilessly, and Ibrahim soon understood why the people around him moved with a slower, more deliberate pace. This was not laziness, as urban dwellers sometimes assumed, but adaptation to an environment where energy had to be conserved and the heat had to be respected. By the time he reached the outskirts of Kasba Mer, Ibrahim's shirt was soaked with sweat. His sandals were coated with dust and his throat was parched. The irony was not lost on him. Here he was, coming to investigate a water crisis while experiencing his own thirst. But his discomfort was temporary and chosen, while the villagers' struggle with water was daily and desperate. The village itself was smaller than he had expected, consisting of perhaps 50 homes scattered along several unpaved lanes. The houses were simple structures, most with flat roofs and small courtyards enclosed by low walls. Laundry hung from lines strung between buildings, and small vegetable gardens struggled in the sandy soil behind many homes. But what struck Ibrahim most forcefully was the quiet. Unlike the bustling energy of the city or even the modest activity he had observed in other rural areas during official visits, Kasba Mer felt subdued, as though it were holding its breath. The few people he saw moved slowly, their faces bearing expressions of resignation that spoke of hopes too often disappointed. And then he saw them, a line of people, mostly women and children, moving slowly along one of the main pathways. Each person carried containers, plastic buckets, metal pots, clay vessels, anything that could hold water. They moved with the weary determination of people engaged in a daily struggle for survival. Ibrahim joined the procession, falling in behind a woman who carried 2 large plastic containers and held the hand of a small boy. The child looked to be about 6 years old, perhaps the same age Fatima had been when she died. His clothes were clean but patched, and his eyes held a seriousness that seemed far too mature for his young face. As they walked, Ibrahim observed the other people in the line. Elderly men who should have been resting in their homes instead struggled with heavy containers. Pregnant women balanced their burden with one hand while protecting their unborn children with the other. Teenage girls who should have been in school carried adult responsibilities on their young shoulders. This was not just a walk to collect water. It was a daily pilgrimage of the desperate, a ritual of survival that consumed hours of every day and defined the rhythm of life in Kasba Mer. The procession led to an open area at the center of the village, where Ibrahim got his first glimpse of the well that had become the source of so much suffering. It was a substantial structure, clearly built with government funds and designed to serve the entire community. The stonework around its rim was solid and well constructed, and the mechanism for drawing water appeared to be in good condition. But controlling access to this lifeline were 3 men who immediately caught Ibrahim's attention. Unlike the villagers, who were dressed simply and bore the marks of honest labor, these men had about them an air of predatory confidence. They were well fed while those around them showed signs of malnutrition. Their clothes, while not expensive, were cleaner and more stylish than what the villagers wore. Most tellingly, they carried thick wooden sticks and spoke in loud, aggressive voices that marked them as people accustomed to intimidating others. Ibrahim watched in growing horror as the scene unfolded before him. The line of villagers stretched across the dusty courtyard, each person clutching their water containers with the desperate grip of those who understood that what should be free might be denied. The sun blazed overhead, turning the open space into a furnace, but no one abandoned their place in the queue. This daily ordeal had become as essential as breathing for the people of Kasba Mer. Ibrahim positioned himself at the back of the line, close enough to observe everything but far enough to avoid immediate attention. From his vantage point, he could see the entire cruel theater that played out daily at the village. Well, the 3 men who controlled the water moved with the casual arrogance of petty tyrants who had grown comfortable with their power. The largest of them, a heavy-set man with a permanently sneering expression, appeared to be their leader. His name, Ibrahim would later learn, was Ghulam, and he had appointed himself the unofficial manager of the well. Beside him stood two younger men, probably his cousins or nephews, who served as his enforcers. Their method was brutally simple. As each villager reached the front of the line, they were required to pay before being allowed to draw water. The amount demanded seemed to vary based on the extortionist's whim and assessment of the person's ability to pay. Elderly villagers were charged less than working-age adults. Families with many children were charged more. Women were often subjected to crude comments and deliberate humiliation as part of the payment process. Ibrahim watched as an elderly woman approached the front of the line, her arthritic hands struggling to manage a large plastic bucket. She reached into the folds of her dress and produced a small collection of coins, probably all the money she had in the world. Ghulam looked at the coins with theatrical disgust. "Is this all you have, old woman? This won't even buy you half a bucket." The woman's voice was barely audible as she pleaded, "Please, Beta, my grandson is sick. He needs water for his medicine. This is all I have today, but I will bring more tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" Ghulam laughed harshly. "What good is tomorrow's money to me today? If you want water today, you pay today's price. If you can't afford it, then get out of line." "But the child is burning with fever," the woman persisted, tears beginning to stream down her weathered face. "Please have mercy." Instead of mercy, Ghulam's response was a rough shove that sent the elderly woman stumbling backward. "I said get out of line. You're holding up paying customers." Ibrahim felt his jaw clench as he watched the woman retrieve her bucket and shuffle away, her shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. This was exactly the kind of scene that had led to Fatima's death. Desperate need met with callous greed. The next person in line was a teenage girl, perhaps 14 or 15 years old, who carried a dented metal pot. She approached the well with obvious reluctance, her eyes downcast and her posture defensive. "Well, well," Ghulam said with a leer that made Ibrahim's skin crawl. "Little Sadia needs water again. You know the price, girl." The teenager fumbled in her pocket and produced a crumpled bill. Ghulam snatched it from her hand and examined it critically. "This is barely enough for half a pot, but maybe we can work out a different kind of payment arrangement." The implication in his voice was unmistakable, and Ibrahim saw the girl's face flush with shame and fear. This was not just extortion, it was the prelude to sexual exploitation of a child. I only need a little water for my baby brother," the girl stammered. "Please, he hasn't had anything to drink since yesterday." "Then you should have brought more money," one of the other men said with a cruel laugh. "Or maybe you should be nicer to us. We might be more generous to pretty girls who know how to be friendly." Ibrahim had seen enough. Every instinct screamed at him to intervene, but he forced himself to remain still and observe. As president, he could order these men arrested immediately, but that would only solve this one instance of the problem. He needed to understand the full scope of what was happening, and why the villagers had allowed this situation to continue. The girl eventually managed to negotiate for a small amount of water by promising to bring vegetables from her family's garden the next day. As she hurried away, Ibrahim noticed that several other people in line were watching with expressions of anger and frustration, but none moved to help her. This pattern continued for the next hour as Ibrahim slowly moved forward in the line. Each interaction followed a similar script: desperate need, arbitrary demands, humiliation, and reluctant compliance. Some villagers managed to pay and receive water. Others were turned away with their containers still empty. What struck Ibrahim most powerfully was not just the cruelty of the extortionists, but the resignation of their victims. These were not people who had never known better times. The well itself testified to the fact that water had once been freely available to everyone. But somehow, the community had allowed these criminals to take control and had adapted to a new normal that should have been unthinkable. As he observed, Ibrahim began to understand the psychology of oppression. The extortionists had not simply seized control overnight. They had gradually increased their demands, testing the community's resistance at each step. They had identified the most vulnerable members of the village and made examples of them. They had created a climate of fear where resistance seemed more dangerous than compliance. Most insidiously, they had made the villagers complicit in their own oppression by creating a system where some could pay and receive water while others could not. This divided the community, making collective resistance less likely because those who could afford to pay had less incentive to fight on behalf of those who could not. When Ibrahim finally reached the front of the line, he found himself face to face with Ghulam. The man looked him up and down with the appraising eye of a predator sizing up new prey. "I don't recognize you," Ghulam said suspiciously. "You're not from this village." Ibrahim kept his voice steady and deferential, playing the role of a humble visitor. "I'm just passing through, seeking work in the area. I heard I could get water here. Water costs money here, stranger? This isn't charity. You want water, you pay like everyone else." Ibrahim reached into his pocket and produced some money, enough to pay for water but not so much as to seem wealthy. Ghulam counted the bills and nodded approval. "Fill your container and move along," he said, gesturing toward the well. But as Ibrahim approached the well, he heard a commotion behind him. A small boy, perhaps 7 years old, had reached the front of the line. His clothes were ragged, his face was streaked with dirt and tears, and his small plastic bottle was cracked and held together with tape. "Please." "Sahib," the child said in a voice that broke Ibrahim's heart. "My sister is very sick. She hasn't had water for 2 days. I don't have money, but I can work for you. I can sweep your houses or carry things." Ghulam looked down at the boy with undisguised contempt. "Work? What work can a little rat like you do? Get out of here before I beat you for wasting my time. Please," the boy persisted. "She might die without water. Please, just a little bit." Instead of water, the boy received a harsh slap across the face that sent him reeling. His plastic bottle flew from his hands and landed in the dirt, cracking further. "I said, get out!" Ghulam roared. "Come back when you have money or don't come back at all." The boy scrambled to retrieve his broken bottle, tears streaming down his face as he ran away from the well. The other villagers in line watched this scene with expressions of pain and anger, but none dared to intervene. For Ibrahim, this was the breaking point. He had witnessed enough cruelty, enough injustice, enough evidence of how power could corrupt and absolute power could destroy human decency. The image of that small boy being struck for asking for water, the same basic need that had killed Little Fatima, ignited a fire in Ibrahim's chest that no amount of presidential protocol could contain. Setting down his own container, Ibrahim walked over to where the boy's broken bottle lay in the dust. He picked it up, examined the cracks, and then looked directly at Ghulam. "This child needs water," he said, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his current disguise. Ghulam's eyes narrowed. "Mind your own business, stranger. You got your water, now move along." "Water is everyone's business," Ibrahim replied, his voice growing stronger. "This well belongs to the village, not to you. That child has as much right to water as anyone else." The courtyard fell silent. Every person in line turned to stare at this stranger who was openly challenging the men who had terrorized them for so long. Even Ghulam seemed momentarily taken aback by this unexpected defiance, but his surprise quickly turned to anger. "You want to be a hero, do you?" he snarled, reaching for the stick at his belt. "Let me teach you what happens to heroes in my territory." As Ghulam advanced on him with obvious violent intent, Ibrahim realized that his moment of truth had arrived sooner than expected. He could back down, apologize, and slip away to safety, maintaining his cover and avoiding confrontation. Or he could stand his ground and accept whatever consequences followed. The choice, when it came, was no choice at all. Looking into the eyes of the villagers around him, people who had lived with injustice for so long that they had forgotten what justice looked like, Ibrahim knew that his presidency, his safety, even his life were less important than this moment. He would not back down. The confrontation that was about to unfold would become the stuff of legend in Kasbah Mer, though none of the villagers present could have predicted how dramatically their lives were about to change. Ibrahim Traoré, the president of the nation, stood in the dusty courtyard disguised as an ordinary laborer, facing down the petty tyrants who had made their lives miserable for years. Ghulam advanced on Ibrahim with his wooden stick raised, confident in his ability to intimidate this interfering stranger, just as he had intimidated countless villagers before. His two companions moved to flank Ibrahim, cutting off potential escape routes. They had used this tactic many times before, a show of overwhelming force that usually ended resistance before it could truly begin. But Ibrahim was not like the other people they had faced. Years of military training in his youth, combined with regular physical fitness routines maintained even during his presidency, had kept him in excellent condition. More importantly, he carried with him the moral authority of someone who had finally chosen to act according to his deepest convictions rather than political convenience. "Last chance, stranger," Ghulam sneered, now close enough that Ibrahim could smell the alcohol on his breath. "Walk away now, or you'll regret ever coming to this village." Ibrahim's response was calm and measured, but it carried an undertone of steel that made several villagers look up in surprise. "The only thing I regret is that it took me so long to get here. This ends now." Instead of backing down or pleading for mercy as Ghulam expected, Ibrahim stepped forward and spoke in a voice that carried across the entire courtyard. "People of Kasbah Mer, how long will you let these men steal what belongs to you? This well was built with your tax money on your land for your benefit. Water is a gift from God, not a commodity to be sold by thieves." Ghulam, enraged by this challenge to his authority in front of his victims, swung his stick in a vicious arc aimed at Ibrahim's head. But Ibrahim was ready. He ducked under the swing and grabbed Ghulam's wrist, using the larger man's momentum against him. With a quick twist, a move he had learned decades ago in military training, he sent Ghulam stumbling sideways. The other two enforcers rushed forward, but Ibrahim was no longer fighting just for himself. He was fighting for every child who had been denied water, for every family that had been humiliated, for every person who had suffered under the tyranny of these petty criminals. The fight was brief but decisive. Ibrahim's military training, combined with his righteous anger and the advantage of surprise, allowed him to handle all three men despite being outnumbered. He didn't seriously injure any of them. His goal was not violence but liberation. But he made it clear that their days of unopposed tyranny were over. When Ghulam found himself on the ground, Ibrahim's foot planted firmly on his chest. The balance of power in Kasbah Mer shifted permanently. "Get out," Ibrahim said, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Take your friends and leave this village. If I see you near this well again, if I hear that you've threatened anyone here, you'll deal with more than just me." As the three men scrambled to their feet and hurried away, muttering threats and curses, Ibrahim turned to face the crowd of villagers who had witnessed this confrontation. Their faces showed a mixture of amazement, fear, and something that had been absent from their eyes for far too long: hope. For several moments, nobody moved. The silence was broken only by the sound of Ghulam and his companions disappearing down one of the village lanes, their angry voices growing fainter with distance. The villagers seemed unable to process what they had just witnessed. A stranger had single-handedly defeated the men who had terrorized them for years. Ibrahim walked over to where the little boy's cracked water bottle still lay in the dirt. He picked it up carefully, as if it were made of the finest crystal rather than cheap plastic held together with tape. Moving to the well, he lowered the bucket and drew up fresh, clean water. With great deliberation, he filled the child's broken bottle, then called out to him, "Come here, son. This water is yours." The boy approached hesitantly, his face still bearing the red mark of Ghulam's slap. His eyes were wide with disbelief as Ibrahim handed him the filled bottle. The child's small hands trembled as he accepted it, and tears began to flow down his cheeks. Not tears of pain this time, but tears of relief and gratitude. "Thank you, uncle," the boy whispered. "My sister will live now." These simple words hit Ibrahim with more force than any political speech or diplomatic achievement ever had. This was what leadership truly meant, not the grand gestures and policy pronouncements that filled newspaper headlines, but the simple act of ensuring that a child could give water to his dying sister. As word of what had happened spread through the line of waiting villagers, more people began to approach the well. An elderly woman Ibrahim had seen earlier, the one who had been turned away, stepped forward tentatively, her empty bucket in her hands. "Sir," she said softly, "may I also take some water for my grandson?" Ibrahim smiled and gestured toward the well. "Mother, this water belongs to you and everyone in this village. You don't need anyone's permission to take what is already yours." One by one, the villagers began to fill their containers. For many of them, this was the first time in years that they had been able to take water without paying, without begging, without humiliation. The simple act of drawing water from their own well became a celebration of dignity restored. But Ibrahim knew that his victory over Ghulam and his men was only the beginning. Physical confrontation had solved the immediate crisis, but it had not addressed the underlying conditions that had allowed the situation to develop in the first place. As he watched the villagers celebrating their newfound access to water, he realized that his real work was just beginning. As the sun began to set over Kasbah Mer, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Ibrahim found himself sitting in the courtyard of the village mosque with a group of villagers who had gathered around him. Word of the stranger who had freed the well had spread quickly through the small community, and people wanted to meet the man who had accomplished what they had thought impossible. The crowd was diverse. Elderly men who remembered when the village had been more prosperous. Middle-aged women who struggled daily to feed their families. Young men who had no opportunities for employment. And children who had known no world other than one where water was a luxury. Each face told a story of hardship endured and hope deferred. Ibrahim listened carefully as they shared their experiences, gradually building a complete picture of how Kasbah Mer had fallen into its current state. The story that emerged was more complex than simple criminal extortion. It was a tale of systematic neglect, failed governance, and the way that abandonment by legitimate authority creates space for illegitimate power to flourish. "It wasn't always like this," explained Haji Mahmud, an elderly man who had lived in the village his entire life. "When I was young, this was a prosperous community. We had good harvests, our children went to school, and government officials would visit regularly to check on our needs." "What changed?" Ibrahim asked, though he suspected he already knew part of the answer. Another villager, a woman named Rashida, who appeared to be in her 40s, spoke up. "The changes happened slowly over many years. First, the school teacher stopped coming regularly. Then the health clinic closed because they said there wasn't enough budget. The road to the main highway was never repaired after the floods 5 years ago, so it became harder for us to sell our crops in the city markets." "And the government officials?" Ibrahim pressed. "When did they stop coming?" "About 3 years ago," said a younger man named Tariq. "We used to see district officials at least twice a year. They would hold meetings, listen to our problems, promise solutions, but the promises were never kept, and eventually they stopped coming at all. We began to feel forgotten." As Ibrahim listened to these accounts, he recognized a pattern that he feared might be replicated in countless villages across his nation. Rural communities were slowly being abandoned by the very government institutions that were supposed to serve them. In the absence of legitimate authority, criminal elements had filled the vacuum. "When did Ghulam and his men first take control of the well?" he asked. "About 2 years ago," Haji Mahmud replied. "At first, they just hung around the area, offering to help people carry water or maintain the well. They seemed helpful, and we appreciated the assistance. But gradually, they began to make demands. First, they asked for small payments for their services. Then they insisted that everyone had to pay. Eventually, they were controlling who could use the well and who couldn't. Did anyone try to resist them?" Ibrahim asked. The villagers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Finally, Tariq spoke up, his voice filled with shame. "Some of us talked about standing up to them, but we were afraid. They had weapons, and they weren't from our village. They had connections to criminal groups in the district capital. We were just farmers and shopkeepers. What could we do against men like that? Besides," added Rashida, "those of us who could afford to pay didn't want to risk losing access to water for our families. It was easier to pay the money and hope someone else would solve the problem." Ibrahim nodded, understanding the psychology that had allowed the situation to persist. Fear, division, and the absence of legitimate authority had created perfect conditions for exploitation. Each villager had acted rationally from their individual perspective, but collectively, Their individual rational decisions had led to an irrational and unjust outcome. "What about contacting the police or other government officials?" he asked. An older woman named Zara laughed bitterly. "The nearest police station is 50 kilometers away, and they have no transportation to get here regularly. We sent messages, but they said it was a local dispute that we should resolve ourselves." Some people suspected that Ghulam was paying bribes to ensure that the authorities would ignore our complaints. As the evening progressed and more villagers joined the conversation, Ibrahim began to understand that the water crisis was just one symptom of a much larger problem. Kasbah Mer had been systematically disconnected from the broader society and economy. Without decent roads, reliable government services, economic opportunities, or effective law enforcement, the village had become vulnerable to exactly the kind of predatory behavior that Ghulam represented. But he also began to see something else in the faces and voices of the people around him, a resilience and basic decency that had survived despite years of hardship. These were not broken people, though they had been badly treated. They were people who had maintained their humanity and their sense of community even under difficult circumstances. "Tell me about your community," Ibrahim said. "How do you help each other when times are difficult?" The response was immediate and animated. The villagers began describing an intricate network of mutual support that had sustained them through their hardships. Families shared food when harvests were poor. Neighbors cared for each other's children when parents were sick. The mosque served not just as a place of worship, but as a community center where problems were discussed and solutions were sought. "We take care of each other," Haji Mahmud said with obvious pride. "That's how we've survived when the government abandoned us." "But we couldn't take care of the water situation," Tariq added sadly. "That required standing up to people who were willing to use violence, and we didn't know how to do that." Ibrahim realized that this was a crucial insight. The village had strong social bonds and a tradition of mutual support, but they had lost confidence in their ability to confront direct challenges to their collective well-being. They had been conditioned to see themselves as powerless in the face of external threats. "What would you say," Ibrahim asked carefully, "if I told you that you do have the power to solve your own problems, that you don't have to wait for outside authorities to rescue you?" The question sparked a long discussion that continued late into the evening. Some villagers were skeptical, pointing out their previous failures to address the water crisis. Others were intrigued by the possibility that they might not be as powerless as they had assumed. "Today showed us something," said Rashida thoughtfully. "When someone was willing to take the first step, when someone showed that Ghulam could be challenged, we realized that he wasn't as strong as we thought. Maybe if we had acted together from the beginning." "It's easy to say that now," Tariq interjected. "But acting together requires trust that others will support you. We were all afraid of being left alone to face the consequences. Ibrahim recognized this as one of the classic problems of collective action. Everyone benefits if the group acts together, but individuals bear costs and risks if they act alone. The solution required building trust and commitment among community members. "What if," he suggested, "you formed a committee to manage the well? What if you established rules that everyone agreed to follow and procedures for enforcing those rules? What if you created a system where the whole community takes responsibility for protecting this resource?" The idea seemed to energize the group. People began suggesting names for the committee, discussing how decisions should be made, and debating what rules would be most effective. For the first time in years, they were talking about their future with optimism rather than resignation. But even as Ibrahim encouraged their planning, he knew that sustainable change would require more than community organizing. The village needed to be reconnected to legitimate government institutions. They needed economic opportunities that would reduce their isolation and vulnerability. They needed education and healthcare services that would strengthen their capacity for self-governance. Most of all, they needed leaders, both at the local and national level, who understood that governing meant serving people like those gathered in this mosque courtyard, not just managing bureaucracies and pursuing political careers. As the meeting began to wind down and people prepared to return to their homes, Haji Mahmud approached Ibrahim with a question that cut to the heart of everything they had been discussing. "Brother," the old man said, "you speak like someone who understands these things very well. You fought those criminals like a man trained for battle, and you talk about government and leadership like someone who has experience with such matters. Who are you really?" Ibrahim looked into the weathered face of this village elder and felt the weight of his deception. These people had opened their hearts to him, shared their deepest fears and hopes, trusted him with their stories of suffering and survival. They deserved honesty in return, but he also knew that revealing his identity would fundamentally change their relationship. Once they knew he was the president, their behavior toward him would be filtered through their expectations of what a president should hear and how citizens should speak to their head of state. The authenticity that had made this evening so valuable would be lost. "I am someone who has learned a great deal by coming here," he said finally. "Someone who needed to understand what life is really like for people like yourselves. As for who I am beyond that, perhaps we can discuss it tomorrow. For now, let me just say that this conversation has been one of the most important of my life." Ibrahim had hoped that Ghulam and his enforcers would take their defeat as a permanent lesson and stay away from Kasbah Mer permanently. But he had underestimated both their greed and their desperation. Men who make their living through intimidation and extortion cannot afford to appear weak, and their humiliating defeat in front of the entire village had damaged their reputation throughout the region. The next morning dawned clear and hot, with the promise of another scorching day. Ibrahim had spent the night in the humble home of Haji Mahmud, sleeping on a simple rope bed in a room that opened directly onto the courtyard. It was the first time in years that he had slept without air conditioning, without servants nearby, without the elaborate security arrangements that normally surrounded him. The experience had been both uncomfortable and strangely liberating. He was awakened by the sound of urgent voices in the courtyard. Stepping outside, he found Haji Mahmud speaking in worried tones with several other villagers who had arrived with disturbing news. "They're back," reported Tariq, his face pale with anxiety. "Ghulam and his men. But this time they've brought reinforcements, at least 6 more men, all armed with sticks and knives. They're camped about 2 kilometers from the village, and they're telling everyone who passes by that they're going to make an example of the village that dared to defy them." Ibrahim felt his stomach tighten with concern, not for himself, but for the villagers who had begun to hope that their ordeal was over. He had anticipated the possibility of retaliation, but he had hoped his demonstration of force would be sufficient to deter further aggression. "What exactly are they saying?" he asked. "According to the traders who passed their camp this morning," Haji Mahmud replied, "Ghulam is telling anyone who will listen that he's going to regain control of the well and punish everyone who supported the stranger who challenged him. He's particularly angry about being humiliated in front of the village women." As word of the impending confrontation spread through Kasbah Mer, Ibrahim could see fear returning to faces that had briefly shown hope. Children were kept close to their mothers. Men gathered in small groups to discuss what they should do. The fragile confidence that had emerged the previous day began to crack under the pressure of renewed threat. "Maybe we should negotiate with them," suggested one villager. "Offer them some compensation if they'll leave us alone." "Negotiate?" Tariq responded angrily. "You want to reward them for terrorizing us? That will just convince them that they can intimidate us whenever they want something." "But what choice do we have?" another man asked. "Yesterday we had one stranger helping us. Today he'll be facing 9 or 10 armed men. Even if he's brave, he can't fight all of them." Ibrahim listened to these discussions with growing understanding of the psychological warfare that Ghulam was waging. By threatening massive retaliation, by bringing superior numbers, by camping close enough to be threatening but far enough away to build anxiety, the criminals were undermining the villagers' newfound confidence before the actual confrontation even began. "Where are they now?" Ibrahim asked Tariq. "Still in their camp, but some scouts reported seeing them moving this way about an hour ago. They're probably planning to arrive around midday when the sun is hottest and most people will be gathered around the well." Ibrahim realized that he was facing a crucial decision. He could reveal his identity and call in his security team to handle the situation. Major General Rashid and his men were certainly positioned close enough to intervene, and a single radio call would bring overwhelming government force to bear on Ghulam's gang. but doing so would rob the villagers of the opportunity to discover their own strength. If they were rescued by external authorities, they would remain dependent on outside protection. The next time criminals threatened them, and there would certainly be a next time, they would again wait helplessly for someone else to save them. Alternatively, he could maintain his disguise and face the enlarged criminal gang alone. The odds were poor, and the risks were significant not just to himself but to his presidency and the stability of the government. If the president of the nation were killed or seriously injured in an obscure village brawl, the consequences would extend far beyond Caspamer. But there was a third option, one that would require all his skills as a leader and his faith in the basic decency of the people he had met over the past day. He could try to organize the villagers to stand up for themselves, to discover that they were not as powerless as they believed. "Listen to me," Ibrahim said, addressing the group of worried men. "Yesterday, you saw what happened when someone was willing to take a stand against these criminals. They're not superhuman. They're not invincible. They derive their power from your fear. And once that fear is overcome, they become what they really are, a small group of bullies who prey on people they think won't fight back." "That's easy to say," replied one of the older men. "But you're talking about fighting armed men. Some of us will be hurt, maybe killed. Is access to free water worth dying for?" Ibrahim looked around the group, meeting each man's eyes in turn. "Let me ask you a different question. Is living in fear, watching your children go thirsty, seeing your daughters humiliated, accepting that criminals can control your lives, is that worth living for? Because that's what you're choosing if you submit to Ghulam again." "But what can we do?" Haji Mahmud asked. "We're farmers and shopkeepers, not fighters." "You're men," Ibrahim replied firmly. "Your fathers protecting your children, husbands defending your wives, citizens reclaiming your rights. You don't need to be professional fighters to stand up for what belongs to you." He began to outline a plan that drew on both his military knowledge and his understanding of the village's resources and layout. The confrontation would not be a direct battle, but a demonstration of collective will that would make clear to Ghulam that his days of easy intimidation were over. "The key," Ibrahim explained, "is that we act together. If even half the men in this village stand united, Ghulam's gang will realize that the cost of controlling the well is higher than the profit they can make from it." Over the next 2 hours, as the sun climbed higher and the anticipated confrontation drew closer, Ibrahim moved through the village talking to individuals and families. He spoke to the women, explaining that their role would be crucial in supporting their husbands and sons. He talked to the younger men, challenging them to prove that they were ready to take responsibility for their community's future. He visited the elderly, asking for their wisdom and blessing for what was to come. Most importantly, he worked to build consensus around a simple principle. The well belonged to the village, and the village would defend what belonged to it. Not everyone was convinced. Some families decided to lock themselves in their homes and wait for the trouble to pass. But a core group of about 20 men, ranging from teenagers to grandfathers, agreed to stand together when Ghulam arrived. They were not warriors, but they were desperate men who had finally reached the limit of their tolerance for injustice. And sometimes, Ibrahim knew from his study of history, desperate men fighting for their homes and families could accomplish things that seemed impossible. As the sun reached its zenith and the heat became almost unbearable, a lookout posted at the edge of the village came running with news that would test everyone's resolve. "They're coming!" he shouted. "All of them, and they're carrying weapons. They look angry and ready for blood." The moment of truth had arrived. The confrontation that was about to unfold in the dusty courtyard of Kasbah Mer would become a defining moment, not just for the village, but for Ibrahim's understanding of leadership and the relationship between government and governed. As he stood with the group of villagers who had agreed to defend their well, he realized that this was no longer about water access or even criminal extortion. This was about whether ordinary people could reclaim control over their own lives. Ghulam's enlarged gang entered the village like a conquering army. There were 9 of them now, including the original 3, and they carried an assortment of weapons: thick wooden clubs, metal pipes, and at least 2 knives that gleamed menacingly in the bright sunlight. They moved with the deliberate swagger of men who expected their reputation to precede them and their victims to scatter before them. But instead of finding a cowering population, they encountered something they had not expected: a line of village men standing shoulder to shoulder in front of the well, their faces set with determination despite the obvious fear in their eyes. Ibrahim stood at the center of this human barrier, but he had insisted that he not be seen as the leader. This had to be the villagers' fight, their victory or defeat, their moment of choosing what kind of people they were going to be. Ghulam stopped about 10 meters from the line of defenders, his face twisted with rage at this unexpected display of defiance. "So," he called out in a voice loud enough for the entire village to hear, "the sheep think they've become wolves. We'll see about that." He gestured to his men, who spread out in a semicircle, trying to use their superior numbers and weapons to intimidate the villagers into backing down. Several of the younger gang members jeered and made threatening gestures, clearly expecting the villagers to break and run, but the line held. Haji Mahmud, despite his age, stood straight and proud. Tariq gripped a farming tool in his hands, his jaw set with determination. Even the teenagers in the group, who had every reason to run from this fight, remained in position. "This is your last chance," Ghulam shouted. "Surrender the stranger who attacked us yesterday, agree to pay double fees for water usage, and we might let the rest of you live." The silence that followed this ultimatum was heavy with tension. Ibrahim could feel the men around him wavering, could sense the natural human impulse to avoid violence and seek compromise. This was the moment when collective action either succeeded or collapsed. It was Haji Mahmud who broke the silence, his aged voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "This well was built by our government for our people. Our children drink from it, our wives cook with its water, our animals depend on it for life. You have no right to control it, and we will not pay you for what is already ours." The old man's words seemed to strengthen the resolve of every villager in the line. Ibrahim felt the change like an electric current passing through the group, the transformation from frightened individuals into a united community. Ghulam's face darkened with fury. He had expected fear, pleading, perhaps some negotiation. He had not expected defiance, especially not from people he had successfully intimidated for years. "Fine," he snarled, raising his club. "You want to die for your precious well? So be it, attack!" What followed was not a battle in any military sense, but rather a chaotic melee that would be remembered in village folklore for generations. Ghulam's gang rushed forward, weapons raised, expecting their show of force to scatter the villagers like startled birds. Instead, they encountered determined resistance that caught them completely off guard. The villagers might not have been trained fighters, but they were defending their homes, their families, and their dignity. They fought with the desperate courage of men who had finally decided that some things were worth the risk of injury or death. Ibrahim found himself in the thick of the fighting, but he was no longer the lone defender he had been the previous day. When one of the gang members swung a metal pipe at his head, Tariq stepped in to block it with his farming tool. When another criminal tried to flank the villagers' line, two of the younger men moved to intercept him. The tide of the battle turned when the village women, who had been watching from their doorways, began to join the fight. Rashida emerged from her house carrying a pot of boiling water, which she hurled at one of the attackers. Another woman threw a bucket full of sand into a gang member's eyes, temporarily blinding him. But the most crucial moment came when little Sadia, the teenage girl who had been humiliated by Ghulam's sexual demands the previous day, picked up a rock and hurled it with all her strength at the gang leader's head. The stone struck him in the temple, causing him to stagger and drop his weapon. This sight, a young girl striking back against her oppressor, seemed to galvanize everyone in the village. Children began throwing stones from upper windows. Elderly men emerged with walking sticks to join the battle. Even the village imam appeared with a shovel in his hands. Faced with the entire community in armed resistance, Ghulam's gang began to retreat. These were men accustomed to picking on isolated individuals and frightened families. They had no experience with fighting an entire population that had united against them. "This isn't over," Ghulam screamed as he and his remaining men fled toward the village outskirts. "We'll be back with more men with real weapons." You'll pay for this! But his threats rang hollow. Everyone in the courtyard could see that he was running, that his authority had been broken as decisively as if it had been made of glass and struck with a hammer. As the dust settled and the villagers began to tend to their minor injuries, Ibrahim realized that something profound had just occurred. This had not been simply a victory over a group of criminals. It had been the rebirth of a community's sense of its own power. The celebration that followed was unlike anything Ibrahim had witnessed during his years in office. There were no speeches, no formal ceremonies, no cameras to record the moment for posterity. Instead, there was simply the joy of people who had rediscovered their own strength and dignity. Women brought out water and bread to share with the defenders. Children who had been hiding in their homes emerged to play around the well that was now truly theirs again. Old men who had not smiled in years found reasons to laugh, but Ibrahim knew that the real work was just beginning. Defeating Ghulam was only the first step in addressing the larger problems that had made his tyranny possible in the first place. That evening, as the village celebrated its victory with a communal meal in the mosque courtyard, Ibrahim faced the moment he had been both anticipating and dreading since his arrival in Kasbah Mer. The time had come to reveal his true identity, but he was uncertain how the villagers would react to learning that their mysterious defender was actually the president of their nation. The celebration had been going on for several hours, with people sharing food, telling stories of the day's battle, and making plans for the future management of the well. Children played games around the edges of the gathering, while their parents discussed forming a village council to prevent future exploitation of their resources. Ibrahim had been watching and listening, marveling at the energy and optimism that had replaced the despair he had observed upon his arrival. But he also noticed that several villagers were stealing glances at him, their expressions showing curiosity mixed with growing suspicion. Finally, Haji Mahmud approached him with a delegation of the village elders. The old man's face was serious, and Ibrahim knew that his moment of reckoning had arrived. "Brother," Haji Mahmud said formally, "we owe you a debt that can never be repaid. You came to our village as a stranger. You fought beside us as a friend, and you showed us that we were stronger than we believed. But many of us have questions about who you really are." Ibrahim looked around the gathering, seeing faces that had become dear to him over the past 2 days. These people had trusted him with their stories, fought beside him in battle, and welcomed him into their community. They deserved the truth regardless of the consequences. "You're right to have questions," Ibrahim replied, his voice carrying to every corner of the courtyard. "I have not been entirely honest with you about my identity, and you deserve to know why I came here and who I really am." The celebration gradually fell silent as word spread that their mysterious defender was about to reveal himself. Even the children stopped playing and gathered around the edges of the crowd, sensing that something important was happening. Ibrahim stood up, feeling the weight of his deception and the magnitude of what he was about to confess. 3 days ago, in my office in the capital, I received a report about a village where criminals were controlling access to water. The report mentioned that a little girl named Fatima had died because her family couldn't afford to pay for water. Several villagers gasped, recognizing the reference to their own recent tragedy. Fatima's mother, who had been sitting quietly at the edge of the gathering, began to weep softly. "That report changed my life," Ibrahim continued, "because it made me realize that I had been living in isolation from the real conditions faced by my people. I decided to come here, not as an official with a convoy and security, but as an ordinary person who could see and experience the truth for himself." He paused, looking directly at each of the village elders. "My name is Ibrahim Traoré, and I am the president of this nation." The silence that followed this revelation was complete and profound. For several long moments, nobody moved or spoke. Then, gradually, the implications began to sink in. Some villagers immediately fell to their knees, overwhelmed by the realization that they had been speaking informally with the head of state, sharing their complaints about government failures with the very person responsible for those failures. But Ibrahim quickly motioned for them to stand. "Please don't kneel to me," Over the past 2 days, you have treated me as an equal, and that is exactly how I wanted to be treated. You have shown me more about leadership and courage than I learned in all my years in office. Tariq was the first to find his voice. You're really the president? The president of our country? I am, Ibrahim confirmed. But more importantly, I'm a man who needed to understand what it means to serve people like yourselves. You have been my teachers, not the other way around. The questions came flooding out then, as the villagers struggled to process this revelation. Why hadn't he told them who he was? Why had he come alone? What did this mean for their village? Ibrahim answered each question patiently, explaining his frustration with receiving only filtered information. His desire to understand the real conditions in forgotten communities like theirs, and his realization that true leadership required him to step out of the protective bubble that surrounded high office. But it was Haji Mahmoud who asked the most important question. Mr. President, now that you have seen how we live, now that you understand our struggles, what will you do? Ibrahim had been thinking about this question since the moment he decided to reveal his identity. He knew that the villagers expected promises of government assistance, development projects, and special attention from the presidential administration. But he also knew that such promises, however well-intentioned, would not address the fundamental problem he had discovered during his time in Kasbah Mer. The village's troubles were not simply the result of insufficient government programs or inadequate budgets. They were the product of a system that had lost touch with the people it was meant to serve. I will do several things, Ibrahim said carefully. First, I will ensure that this district receives proper government services, regular police patrols, maintained roads, functioning schools and clinics. You should not have to live in isolation from the rest of our nation, the villagers murmured approvingly. But Ibrahim held up his hand to indicate he wasn't finished. But second, and more importantly, I will work to change how our government operates at every level. I will require that officials regularly visit communities like yours, not for ceremonial occasions, but to understand your real needs and challenges. I will establish systems to ensure that your voices are heard in the capital, not filtered through layers of bureaucracy that remove the human element from policymaking. He paused, looking around at the faces surrounding him. And third, I will tell your story, the story of how a community that felt powerless discovered its own strength, how ordinary people standing together could overcome seemingly impossible odds. Your victory today is a lesson that every village, every community in our nation needs to hear. As the evening progressed, the conversation shifted from questions about Ibrahim's identity to discussions about the future. The villagers shared their hopes for better schools, improved health care, and economic opportunities that would allow their children to prosper without having to leave home. But more than material improvements, they talked about the change they felt within themselves. The knowledge that they had faced down armed criminals and won had given them confidence to tackle other challenges. They began planning not just for better management of the well, but for community projects that could improve their overall quality of life. Ibrahim found himself thinking about the broader implications of what he had witnessed. If the people of Kasbah Mer could transform themselves from passive victims into active agents of their own destiny, what did that mean for other communities facing similar challenges? As the gathering finally began to wind down near midnight, Ibrahim realized that his journey to this remote village had accomplished far more than he had originally intended. He had come seeking understanding of his people's struggles, but he had also discovered a model for governance that he had never learned in any political science textbook. Real leadership, he now understood, was not about making decisions in isolation and then imposing them on others. It was about joining with people in their struggles, understanding their challenges from the inside, and helping them discover their own capacity for solving problems. The president who would return to the capital tomorrow would be fundamentally different from the one who had left 3 days earlier. And the changes he would implement in the government would reflect not abstract theories about administration, but concrete lessons learned in the dust and heat of a village courtyard where ordinary people had accomplished extraordinary things. 6 months after Ibrahim's transformative visit to Kasbah Mer, the changes in both the village and the nation were remarkable. The story of the president who had disguised himself as a common laborer to fight alongside villagers against local criminals had spread throughout the country, inspiring similar acts of community resistance in dozens of other locations. But more importantly, Ibrahim had kept his promises to the people of Kasba Mer and to communities like theirs across the nation. The village now received regular visits from government officials, but these were not ceremonial occasions with prepared presentations. Instead, they were working sessions where officials rolled up their sleeves and participated in community projects, listening to concerns and collaborating on solutions. A proper road had been built connecting Kasba Mer to the main highway, allowing farmers to get better prices for their crops by accessing larger markets. A health clinic had been established with a resident nurse and regular visits from a doctor. The school had been reopened with qualified teachers and adequate supplies, but perhaps most significantly, the village had established its own governance structures based on the lessons learned during their confrontation with Ghulam's gang. A village council made decisions by consensus, with representation from all segments of the community, including women and young people. They had created their own security committee to ensure that no criminals could again gain control over essential resources. The well itself had become more than just a source of water. It had become a symbol of what communities could accomplish when they refused to accept injustice as inevitable. At the national level, Ibrahim had instituted sweeping reforms in how government officials interacted with rural communities. The Kasba Mer Protocol, as it became known, required administrators to spend at least 1 week every quarter in remote villages, living simply and addressing problems directly alongside local communities. More importantly, Ibrahim had fundamentally changed his own approach to governance. The ornate presidential palace now regularly hosted village councils from across the nation. Farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, and ordinary citizens were invited to share their experiences and contribute to policymaking. The presidential office that had once been isolated behind layers of protocol became a place where real voices could be heard. The crystal chandelier still cast its dancing light across the mahogany desk, but now the desk was often covered with reports written by village committees, letters from rural schools, and photographs of community projects. The comfortable leather chair still symbolized the office's authority, but Ibrahim no longer saw it as a throne of isolation. Instead, it had become a seat of responsibility, a place from which he could serve the people who had taught him the true meaning of leadership. On quiet evenings, Ibrahim would often hold in his hands the cracked plastic water bottle that had belonged to the little boy in Kasba Mer, the same bottle he had filled with water when the well was finally free. The village had given it to him as a gift during his official return visit, and it had become his most treasured possession, a reminder that true leadership was measured not in grand gestures or political victories, but in small acts of justice that changed individual lives. The boy's sister had recovered, the village had prospered, and Kasba Mer had become a symbol of what communities could accomplish when they rediscovered their own strength. But for Ibrahim, the greatest transformation had been his own, from a leader who ruled from above to one who served from within, from a president who received filtered reports to one who understood that the highest office in the land was only meaningful when it was used to ensure that no child would ever again have to die for want of something as simple as clean water. As he looked out from his presidential windows at the lights of the capital city, each light no longer represented just statistics or demographics, but real families with real struggles and real dreams. And in his heart, Ibrahim carried the voices of Kasba Mer, voices that had taught him that true power came not from commanding others, but from standing with them in their darkest hours and helping them discover the light within themselves. The president's journey had ended where it began, with the recognition that leadership was ultimately about service. Justice was about action, and the greatest victories were won not in palaces or parliament halls, but in dusty village courtyards where ordinary people chose to be extraordinary. In the years that followed, the story of President Ibrahim's visit to Kasba Mer would be told and retold across the nation, inspiring new generations of leaders to remember that those who govern must never forget those whom they serve. And in a small village where a well still provided free water to all who needed it, Children would grow up knowing that justice was not a distant ideal, but something that could be achieved whenever people found the courage to stand together and demand what was rightfully theirs.